For thousands of years, the land known today as Israel has stood at the center of some of humanity's most powerful stories. It is a place where faith, identity, and survival collided again and again across the centuries. Empires rose and fell over this narrow strip of land. Kings fought to control it, prophets walked its hills, and countless generations believed it to be sacred. Yet despite the armies that marched across it and the civilizations that tried to claim it, the story of this land has never truly belonged to conquerors. Instead, it belongs to the people who refuse to let their identity disappear. To understand how this small region became one of the most contested places on Earth, we must travel far back into the ancient world, long before the rise of modern nations, before the Roman Empire, even before the birth of the major world religions. Our journey begins along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea in a region historically known as the Levant. At the heart of this region lay an ancient territory called Canaan. Geographically, Canaan occupied one of the most strategic positions in the ancient world. To the west stretched the Mediterranean Sea, linking it to Europe. To the south lay the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. To the east rose the great civilizations of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And to the north stood Anatolia and the Caucasus, regions that connected the Near East to Asia. Because of this location, Canaan became a crossroads of cultures, trade routes, and migrating peoples. Caravans passed through its valleys carrying spices, metals, and textiles. Ideas, languages, and religions traveled alongside them. Whoever controlled this land could influence the movement of goods and armies across 3 continents. Human life in this region stretches back to prehistoric times. During the late Paleolithic and early Neolithic periods, communities began settling in fertile valleys and coastal plains. The climate allowed agriculture to flourish, and early villages slowly transformed into organized settlements. One of the most remarkable places from this early era is the ancient city of Jericho. Located near the Jordan River, Jericho is often considered one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. Archaeological excavations have revealed massive stone walls and defensive towers built thousands of years ago. Some of these structures date back nearly 11,000 years. For millennia, different tribes and cultures lived across the region. But by the 3rd millennium BCE, a group known as the Canaanites had emerged as the dominant population. The Canaanites were a Semitic people who built powerful city-states throughout the region. Cities such as Jericho, Megiddo, and Hazor became thriving urban centers, connected to the wider world through trade networks that reached Egypt and Mesopotamia. Like many ancient societies, the Canaanites practiced polytheism. Their religion included a wide pantheon of gods associated with natural forces, fertility, and war. Temples and ritual practices formed an important part of their daily life. Yet within this land of many gods, something extraordinary was beginning to take shape, an idea that would later transform religious history. According to ancient tradition, the origins of the Jewish people begin with a figure named Abraham. The story places his birthplace in the city of Ur in Mesopotamia. One day, Abraham is said to have received a divine command to leave his homeland and journey west toward the land of Canaan. This journey marked the beginning of a covenant between Abraham and God. In return for his faith, Abraham was promised that his descendants would inherit the land and become a great nation. The story of Abraham sits somewhere between history and sacred narrative. Whether viewed through religious belief or historical curiosity, his journey represents the symbolic starting point of the Israelite identity. Generations later, Abraham's lineage expanded through his descendants. One of the most significant figures among them was Jacob, who, according to tradition, had 12 sons. These sons would become the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob himself received a new name, Israel, and his family eventually moved to Egypt during a devastating famine. There, they initially found protection and prosperity under the rule of the Egyptian pharaoh. But over time, circumstances changed. The Israelites, once welcomed guests, became an enslaved population, forced into hard labor under Egyptian authority. From this oppression emerged one of the most powerful stories in ancient history, the story of Moses. Raised within Egyptian society, yet connected to the enslaved Israelites, Moses would eventually become the leader who challenged Pharaoh's rule. According to tradition, a divine encounter at a burning bush revealed his mission to free his people. What followed was one of the most dramatic narratives in religious history, a confrontation between a prophet and an empire. And that confrontation would change the destiny of the Israelites forever. The story of Moses stands as one of the most powerful turning points in the early history of the Israelites. According to ancient tradition, he was born during a time when the Israelites were suffering under harsh Egyptian rule. Fearing the growing population of the Hebrews, the Pharaoh ordered that every newborn Israelite boy be killed. To save him, Moses' mother placed the infant in a basket and set it afloat on the Nile River. The child was eventually discovered and adopted by a member of the Egyptian royal household. Raised inside the palace, Moses grew up between two worlds, Egyptian royalty and the oppressed people he truly belonged to. Years later, after witnessing the suffering of the Israelites, Moses fled Egypt and lived in exile in the desert region of Midian. It was there, according to biblical tradition, that he experienced a moment that would define his destiny. While tending sheep, Moses encountered a burning bush that was not consumed by fire. From this bush, God spoke to him and commanded him to return to Egypt. His mission was clear: confront Pharaoh and demand the freedom of the Israelites. When Moses returned, Pharaoh refused to release the slaves. What followed were a series of disasters remembered as the 10 plagues of Egypt. Rivers turned to blood, swarms of insects filled the land, and darkness covered the skies. Each plague was meant to pressure Pharaoh into letting the Israelites leave. Finally, after the last and most devastating plague, the death of Egypt's firstborn sons, Pharaoh relented and allowed the Israelites to depart. This event became known as the Exodus. As the story continues, Pharaoh quickly changed his mind and sent his army after the escaping Israelites. According to tradition, the Israelites reached the shores of the Red Sea with Egyptian forces closing in behind them. At that moment, Moses stretched out his staff, and the waters parted, allowing the Israelites to cross safely. When the Egyptian army followed, the waters returned, destroying Pharaoh's pursuing soldiers. Whether interpreted as history, legend, or sacred narrative, the Exodus became one of the defining moments in Jewish identity, the story of liberation from oppression. But the journey was far from over. After leaving Egypt, the Israelites wandered in the wilderness for decades. During this time, Moses became not only a political leader, but also a spiritual guide. According to tradition, it was during this journey that he received the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, laws that would form the moral and religious foundation of Israelite society. The wandering generation would never fully enter the Promised Land. Near the end of his life, Moses climbed Mount Nebo and looked across the land of Canaan from a distance. There he died, leaving leadership of the Israelites to his successor, Joshua. Under Joshua's command, the Israelites finally entered Canaan. However, the land was not empty. Various Canaanite cities and tribes already lived there, and the Israelites had to fight for territory and survival. Some cities fell quickly, while others resisted fiercely. One of the most famous stories from this period is the fall of Jericho. According to tradition, the Israelites marched around the city walls for 7 days. On the final day, the walls collapsed, allowing them to capture the city. Over time, Israelite tribes settled throughout the region. But there was no central government or united kingdom. Instead, the tribes were loosely organized and led by figures known as judges. These leaders were not kings, they were temporary commanders and prophets who emerged during times of crisis. When enemies threatened the Israelites, a judge would rise, lead the people in battle, restore order, and then fade from power. This period was marked by a repeating cycle: peace, corruption, invasion, and rescue. Eventually, the tribes began to feel vulnerable without a strong central authority. Surrounded by powerful enemies, especially the Philistines along the Mediterranean coast, they demanded a king. Thus began the era of the Israelite monarchy. The first king chosen to rule over the united tribes was Saul. Coming from the tribe of Benjamin, Saul initially appeared strong and capable. He successfully defended Israel against several neighboring threats, including the Philistines and the Ammonites. However, according to biblical tradition, Saul's reign eventually fell out of favor with God due to acts of disobedience. During this time, another figure quietly emerged in the background, a young shepherd named David. David was the youngest son in his family, unlikely to become anything more than a farmer or shepherd. But his life changed forever during a confrontation with one of Israel's greatest enemies. A massive Philistine warrior named Goliath had been challenging the Israelite army, daring anyone to fight him in single combat. None of the soldiers dared to step forward, but David did. Armed with nothing but a sling and a few stones, the young shepherd faced the giant warrior. In one swift strike, David's stone hit Goliath in the forehead, bringing the massive fighter down. The victory shocked both armies, and in that moment, David's legend was born. But this triumph would soon place him on a dangerous path, one that would eventually lead to the throne of Israel. David's victory over Goliath transformed him from an unknown shepherd into a rising hero of Israel. Songs were sung about his courage, and his reputation quickly spread across the tribes. At first, King Saul welcomed David into his court. He even married David to his daughter and made him a commander in the army. But popularity can be dangerous. As David's fame grew, Saul began to fear him. The king worried that the young warrior might one day replace him. Suspicion turned into jealousy, and jealousy turned into hatred. Saul eventually tried to kill David, forcing him to flee and live as a fugitive for years. During this time, David gathered loyal followers and survived by moving through wilderness regions and foreign territories. Despite several opportunities to overthrow Saul by force, David refused to do so, believing it was not his place to harm the king. Saul's reign came to a tragic end around the year 1000 BCE during a battle against the Philistines. Defeated and wounded, Saul took his own life on Mount Gilboa. Several of his sons also died in the battle, leaving the kingdom in chaos. In the aftermath, David was first crowned king by his own tribe of Judah. For several years he ruled from the city of Hebron, while conflict continued among the remaining tribes. Eventually, David managed to unite the tribes under one rule, creating the first unified kingdom of Israel. One of David's most important decisions was choosing a new capital city. He captured the fortified city of Jerusalem and made it the political and spiritual center of his kingdom. Located between the northern and southern tribes, Jerusalem was strategically neutral and easier to defend. Under David's leadership, Israel expanded its territory and strengthened its military power. Longtime enemies like the Philistines were defeated, and Israel began to emerge as a significant regional state. Yet David's life was not free from controversy, and personal decisions and family conflicts created internal problems within the kingdom. One of the most famous scandals involved his relationship with Bathsheba and the death of her husband, an event that caused political tension and rebellion within the royal family. Despite these struggles, David's reign is often remembered as a golden era in Israel's early history. When David died, the throne passed to his son Solomon. Solomon inherited a stable and prosperous kingdom. Unlike his father, whose rule was defined by warfare, Solomon's reign focused on diplomacy, trade, and massive building projects. His most famous achievement was the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. Completed around the middle of the 10th century BCE, the temple became the religious heart of the Israelite world. According to tradition, it housed the Ark of the Covenant and served as the central place of worship for the people of Israel. The temple symbolized unity, faith, and national identity. Solomon also developed extensive trade networks with neighboring kingdoms. Alliances with powerful rulers brought wealth and luxury to Jerusalem. The kingdom experienced a period of cultural and economic growth. However, prosperity came with a price. To finance his grand construction projects and royal court, Solomon imposed heavy taxes and forced labor on the population. Over time, many people began to feel disconnected from their king. The once unified kingdom started to fracture under growing social and economic pressure. When Solomon died around 930 BCE, the fragile unity of Israel collapsed. His son Rehoboam became king, but he refused to reduce the heavy taxes that burdened the people. In response, 10 northern tribes rebelled and formed a separate kingdom called Israel. The southern tribes remained loyal to Rehoboam and established the kingdom of Judah with Jerusalem as its capital. From that moment, the once united nation split into two rival states. The northern kingdom of Israel was generally larger and more prosperous, but it was also politically unstable, experiencing frequent changes in leadership and internal conflict. The southern kingdom of Judah, though smaller, maintained the Davidic royal line and kept Jerusalem as its religious center. For centuries, both kingdoms existed side by side, sometimes cooperating but often competing. Unfortunately, their division made them vulnerable to the powerful empires rising around them. In 722 BCE, the expanding Assyrian Empire invaded the northern kingdom. After a long siege, the capital city of Samaria fell. Many inhabitants were deported and scattered throughout the Assyrian Empire. These displaced populations later became known in tradition as the Lost Tribes of Israel. The southern kingdom of Judah survived for a while longer, but its fate was eventually sealed as well. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian Empire conquered Jerusalem after a brutal siege. The city was destroyed, and the first temple, once the pride of Israel, was burned to the ground. Many of Judah's leaders, priests, and scholars were taken into exile in Babylon. For the Jewish people, this was more than a political defeat. It was a spiritual crisis. Their temple was gone, their homeland was lost. But their identity would not disappear. Instead, the years of exile would reshape Judaism and prepare the Jewish people for an entirely new chapter in their history. For decades after the fall of Jerusalem, the Jewish people lived far from their homeland. Many of the leaders, scholars, and craftsmen of Judah had been taken to Babylon, where they were forced to build new lives in exile. Yet something remarkable happened during this period. Even without their temple and their land, the Jewish people managed to preserve their traditions. Religious teachings were recorded more carefully than ever before, and communities gathered to study their sacred laws and stories. Their identity, instead of disappearing, became even stronger. Then, in 539 BCE, the political landscape of the ancient world changed dramatically. A new empire had risen in the east, the Persian Empire under the leadership of King Cyrus the Great. When Persian armies conquered Babylon, Cyrus introduced policies that were very different from those of previous conquerors. Instead of suppressing the cultures and religions of conquered peoples, he often allowed them to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. For the Jewish exiles, this decision changed everything. Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their sacred temple. After decades in exile, groups of Jewish families began the long journey back to their ancestral land. The task awaiting them was enormous. Jerusalem was still largely in ruins, and rebuilding both the city and the temple required tremendous effort. Resources were limited, and neighboring groups sometimes opposed the reconstruction. Despite these obstacles, the Jewish community slowly rebuilt their religious center. Around 516 BCE, the Second Temple was finally completed. Though it lacked the wealth and grandeur of Solomon's temple, it symbolized something even more important: survival. During this period, Jewish religious life continued to evolve. Leaders such as Ezra and Nehemiah worked to strengthen the community and re-establish the importance of the Torah as the foundation of Jewish law and identity. Synagogues also began appearing as places of learning and worship. Unlike the temple, which served as a single central sanctuary, synagogues allowed Jewish communities to practice their faith, even when they were scattered across different regions. These developments would later play a crucial role in helping Judaism survive centuries of displacement. For nearly 200 years, the Persian Empire ruled over the region with relative stability. But in the 4th century BCE, a new force emerged from the west that would once again reshape the entire region. His name was Alexander. Alexander of Macedon, later known as Alexander the Great, launched one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in history. Beginning in Greece, he led his armies across Asia Minor through Syria and Egypt and deep into the Persian Empire. Within just a few years, Alexander defeated Persia and became ruler of a vast territory, stretching from the Mediterranean to India. When his armies reached the lands of Judea, the region once again found itself under foreign rule. Alexander's conquest introduced a new cultural influence known as Hellenism, the spread of Greek language, art, philosophy, and traditions across the territories he conquered. In many places, local populations adopted aspects of Greek culture. Cities began using the Greek language in administration and trade. Greek-style architecture, education, and philosophy spread across the eastern Mediterranean. In Judea, however, this cultural transformation created deep divisions. Some Jewish communities welcomed aspects of Greek culture and believed it could coexist with their traditions. Others feared that Hellenism threatened their religious identity. This tension eventually exploded during the rule of a Seleucid king named Antiochus IV in the 2nd century BCE. Antiochus attempted to force Greek religious practices onto the Jewish population. Traditional Jewish rituals were banned, and the temple in Jerusalem was desecrated with the installation of a pagan altar dedicated to Zeus. For many Jews, this was an unacceptable attack on their faith. In response, a rebellion broke out led by a priestly family known as the Hasmoneans. The revolt began in a small town called Modane, where a priest named Mattathias refused to perform a pagan sacrifice demanded by imperial officials. After Mattathias' death, leadership of the rebellion passed to his son Judah, who became known as Judah Maccabee, the Hammer. Using guerrilla tactics and deep knowledge of the terrain, Judah's forces repeatedly defeated larger Seleucid armies. After several years of fighting, the rebels managed to capture Jerusalem and reclaim the temple. The temple was purified and rededicated, an event commemorated in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. For a brief period, the Hasmonean dynasty ruled Judea as an independent Jewish kingdom. But this independence would not last forever. As internal conflicts weakened the kingdom, a new superpower was expanding across the Mediterranean world: Rome. By the 1st century BCE, Roman armies had begun moving eastward, absorbing territories one by one. Eventually, Roman general Pompey marched into Jerusalem in 63 BCE. From that moment on, Judea became part of the growing Roman sphere of influence. The era of Roman rule had begun, and it would lead to some of the most dramatic and painful chapters in Jewish history, chapters that would ultimately scatter the Jewish people across the world and shape the story of Israel for the next 2,000 years.